Welcome to Vancouver Rape Relief's 2020 Montreal Massacre Memorial. This year, as you may know, we're hosting a series of 12 online events. You can find our full program on our website at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. My name is Florence. I'm a collective member at Vancouver Rape Relief. And I'm with my partner, other member, Hela, as well, that you will hear speak. I will introduce you to my other panelists in just a few minutes as well. We are live on Facebook as well as Zoom for our panel today titled Frontline Response to Women During COVID-19. So the topic of today, it's clear that COVID-19 did not create many of the struggles that women are facing. Rather, it highlighted and exacerbated the existing struggles of the oppressed classes. Women represent the majority of frontline service, hospitality, healthcare, and retail workers in North America, and they are disproportionately impacted by layoffs and shutdowns. New data shows that not only women's participation in the workforce is at a historical low, but racialized, low-income, and immigrant women have been especially hit by the pandemic's economic impacts. Stats Canada reported that in July, South Asian, Arab, and Black Canadians had among the highest unemployment rates. Women tend to take on the bulk of unpaid family care at home, a burden carried at higher rate than prior to COVID-19. In March and April in the United States, anti-abortion groups have exploited the pandemic to restrict access to abortions across the country. A number of Republican officials in different states, including Oklahoma, Ohio, Kentucky, and Texas, ordered abortion providers to postpone most abortion procedures, saying abortions are not essential. And in September, we at Vancouver Rape Relief produced a podcast about the impact of COVID-19 on women. I invite you to listen to it. We heard from members of the Vancouver Committee for Domestic Workers and Caregivers' Rights, whose women they help are mostly women of color and migrant women. And the women that they support told them that COVID created a chain reaction because the families they work with were laid off, and they work for actually, were laid off. So they were laid off as well. And some of the women had to move in with their employers in order to keep their job as domestic workers. We also spoke with Strength in Sisterhood, who work with incarcerated women and are calling for the abolition of prison. They told us how COVID affected women in prison, and at the Grand Valley Institution for Women in Ontario, women reported that guards would fake cough to scare women of the virus. At some point also, women were only allowed 50 minutes outside per day, even more limited access to phones, and saw the suspension of the programs necessary for their release. So to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on women and the response that was and is still given to women in relation to the pandemic, we have with us different feminist groups who do frontline work and fight against male violence against women. We have with us Diane Retsky from Mamawichi Ita in Manitoba. Hi. We have Pragna Patel from Southall Black Sisters in the UK. We have Jenny Laure Sully from La Clé, la concertation des luttes contre l'exploitation sexuelle, joining us from Quebec. We have Megan Walker from London Abuse Women's Centre, joining us from Ontario. And we have Hela Kerner from Vancouver Rape Relief. So we will have a Q&A portion. So if you have questions, I invite you to write them in the chat on Zoom and in the comments section on Facebook. And if you are watching on Facebook, we're also asking if you can press the share button, share it right away with your followers and friends so that they can watch as well. So welcome. We'll start with each of our panelists giving us 15 minutes, about 10 to 15 minutes to answer to our question, which is, what does your group do? Who are the women you're working with? And how the women you work with were impacted by COVID, and how are you responding to them? So we will start with Diane.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And I really want to take a moment to honor the reason why we're here today, and really thank the leadership of Vancouver Rape Relief and all the work that you're doing that is really giving voice of the voiceless oftentimes, and always coming up with solutions and sharing information and really creating that community, that sisterhood that we need in order to be able to work together to solve this issue of inequality and equity and violence against women. And so, again, my name is Diane Redsky. I work for an organization called the Wichita Center in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional territory of Treaty 1 and homeland of the Métis Nation that I have the privilege of living and working on. I also wish to acknowledge the treaty territory of my ancestors of Treaty 3, Shoal Lake First Nation 40, where I come from. And so those are really important to acknowledge, because we are, as Indigenous people, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, reclaiming our rightful place in society. And so those are some of the ways in which we are doing this. And so this is a really important topic, because as an Indigenous-led organization in Winnipeg, Manitoba, we have the largest Indigenous population in Canada. So we're called the Indigenous capital of Canada in terms of how many First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and non-status that are living in our city. And so this comes with both opportunities and challenges. And so there's an incredible amount of strong, powerful women. Many organizations that are in our city are led by women and are really doing incredible work. And that also being said, in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, if you've been watching the COVID numbers, we have, it's out of control. And we have a really important opportunity to do something about that. And so what we're finding, and our work has been really focusing in on supporting Indigenous women, many who are single parents, that would rely on organizations like the Wichita Center for your basic needs. And so they would be coming to us for food and for diapers and for opportunities to volunteer, and opportunities sometimes to get that chance to rebuild their lives from violence, or rebuild their lives from poverty, because for lack of opportunities that they have. And so we have also ensured that, as COVID is now the stay at home message, has really impacted, especially particularly when women are living in violent situations, and where staying at home is not always the safest place for you. And so we have been really reaching out and trying to do something virtually as best we can. And then there's complicating factors with that, because not everybody has internet, not everybody has the technology or the hardware or software in order to be able to participate. And so it has become really, we have been having to be really creative about how we are reaching out to ensure the safety and protection of women when they have that stay at home messaging from everybody when home is not that safe. But also with really vulnerable women who are on Winnipeg streets. And this is critically important, because what COVID has done has really magnified and amplified people who are, particularly women, who are already marginalized, already living in poverty, and it just magnified that too. So people who are poor are poorer than before COVID. And so our response has been reaching out to the very vulnerable women, has been reaching out and giving more food and giving more resources, because we're finding that you would think the sexual exploitation of women and girls would go down because of COVID, because there's public health reasons why. But we're not seeing that in Winnipeg. It hasn't changed one bit, but what has changed is that women are now being it's a situation where men are taking advantage of women, and so they are having to do more for less money. So the sexually exploited woman who could in order to pay the rent or to make ends meet or to get food on the table, that they normally would be sexually exploited, through male violence, out on Winnipeg streets for a couple of hours, and yet now we're seeing them out for 12 to 15 hours to get the same amount of money. And so that just puts them way more at risk, and really has creating a very unique vulnerability for them. And so these are really critically important, because as we worry about women who are further marginalized and further victimized as a result of their desperation. So because surviving during COVID is becoming much more harder. So we were just surviving before, but then COVID hit, and surviving now is even harder. And so I do want to acknowledge the really important work that many other community organizations have done to meet women where they're at and helping them on the front lines. And so with much more work to do, and I'm looking forward to hearing the questions from others around what are some of the solutions that we can move forward on, such as guaranteed livable income. There's just not enough money in the hands of people who need it. And so I leave that as my presentation, and I look forward to the others.
Thank you. Move on to Megan.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Walker, and I am a member of a very strong group of advocates, 12 incredible women that I have the honor of working with every single day at the London Abused Women's Centre. We are actually open now 38 years in the city of London, Ontario, which is between Windsor and Toronto, for those that don't know the area. And last year, this incredible group of women I work with provided service to 8,127 women and girls over the age of 12. And of those, just to carry on a little bit about what Diane had to say, 1,342 identified as either prostituted, trafficked, or sexually exploited. So this is a major crisis in this country, as it is in many countries across the world. Part of the work we do is to address the systemic barriers that women face every day as they work to live their lives free from violence and free from oppression. And so we are known as an agency in this community that takes on power, and especially things like the legal system, police services, and the healthcare system. And we not only take on these systems, but we do acknowledge the good work they do on occasion as well. So we want to make sure that they listen to us, and that when they are enacting some of the recommendations we make, that we are publicly acknowledging that as well. So all of our programs are woman-centered and survivor-led, whether it's survivor from sexual exploitation or from an intimate partner. We really rely upon the lives, the lived experiences of women and girls to help form and create our programming at the agency. In addition, we do provide counseling services to family members of women and girls who are being trafficked or sexually exploited. We know that oftentimes the family members will continue to search online at advertisements to determine if their children, their daughters, are alive or dead, which is extremely difficult on family members who are, first of all, seeing naked and horrendous pictures of their daughters, but secondly, not even aware from day to day whether they will be alive or not. And so we try to help with that burden by taking on some of the research and investigative components of that. and to provide them with counseling and advocacy so that they too can start breathing a little bit easier from day to day. We recognize that Indigenous women are disproportionately impacted by systemic oppression. And we take our leadership in addressing that from Indigenous peoples in our community who continue to generously support us with their advice around programming and policies. And we're very grateful for that. We also do public awareness campaigns. We just recently ended our Shine the Light on Woman Abuse campaign, which involves many parts of Canada as well as Sweden and parts of Australia, working to raise awareness around the issue of male violence against women and girls in the hope that people will start talking about it and asking questions. And community members will continue to support women in reaching out for services. We also work with communities across Canada, including Vancouver Rape Relief and Hilla and the entire team, to do things like polling on prostitution and Canada's prostitution legislation, which is the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And in 2018, we polled Ontarians, and it showed that 6 in 10 Ontarians opposed decriminalized prostitution. And that was important for us to do because there is a very loud and vocal lobby that does support decriminalized prostitution. And we wanted to make sure that politicians know that those voices do not represent the voices of all women, and in fact, only represent the voices of the few. So this past summer, we did another poll, which was a national poll. Again, Vancouver Rape Relief was part of that, as well as many community partners across Canada. And that poll, which was national, Canadian in nature, showed that Canadians are 5 times more likely to support Canada's legislation than they are to oppose it. So that was really important for us, and it's continuing to be important to us as the Government of Canada talks now about reviewing our prostitution legislation. And we know again that they're being influenced by the pro decriminalization lobby. And we have a really interesting and great relationship with our London Police Service. And so we have a relationship where we know that we can provide the best service possible to women by working collaboratively with police. And so when a woman speaks about charges she has faced, as an example, we can pick up the phone and have a relationship back and forth to make sure that things have been handled appropriately. So we have a domestic violence unit as well as a trafficking unit. And we are pretty much in touch with either unit every single day. And we actually have had great success with our police service. So a few years ago, London Police Service recognized prostitution as sexual exploitation and as a crime, and now releases the names of all individuals who are charged with sex purchasing. So that was kind of a good win for us because we've been advocating for that position for around 10 years. COVID, of course, has really changed the way we do our work. And more importantly, it's changed the way women can access service safely. So what we saw during COVID, first of all, we were forced out of our workplace because of the provincial legislation that said, you know, unless you are a health worker, you cannot provide service. And so, or service from your office because of the, contagion of the virus. And so we all started working from home, which meant telephone and Zoom counseling. Really less than ideal for women, for sure. And also very difficult on staff who then are working with really difficult situations and are isolated in doing so and don't have the support in the next office that they can go and speak to a colleague. And so, we were closed for approximately 2 months, and during the closure time, we were able to secure funding to allow us to put the acrylic barriers throughout our offices. We were able to get all of the PPE that we needed and all of that sort of stuff. So we were able to open our office again with our fundamental mandate that all women have a right to immediate access to service. So we knew, for instance, that shelters were full. The shelters are always full, but even more so during COVID. And what we found was that the City of London itself had received provincial funding to be able to provide extra space through hotels. So instead of trying to address the issue from a homelessness perspective and provide the tools that women need to actually have permanent housing, they decided to house women in hotels. And unfortunately, all of the hotels that they chose to house women in were those hotels and motels that were off our 400 series highway and are known trafficking hubs. So it made it very difficult for many agencies to refer women to that area, knowing that they were really at risk of being lured into trafficking and prostitution. So what we have found is that women during COVID and after are now, as Diane said when she spoke about providing more service for less money, we are hearing on an ongoing basis that the women are forced to provide more violent services to men and role play from fetish sites and from pornography sites, and are enduring horrendous acts of torture and assault and suffocation and choking and strangulation as a regular and routine part of now what they are expected to do for men. So we actually find that extremely difficult for us to listen to, as well, as you can imagine. And we've implemented a number of strategies for our staff team for vicarious trauma, and our board has increased its funding for self-care and for counseling services. And so this is something we've really noticed during COVID that is now off the charts. I want to just say that in the midst of all of this happening, on March 31st, without any official notice, the feminist Trudeau government withdrew our entire trafficking fund. So we went from receiving $140,000 a year to provide trafficking services to women and girls to receiving zero from the federal government. And even now, there is no funding being made available for trafficking. Lots and lots of agencies are filling out lots and lots of grant applications that are available, but to date, the funding has not come through. And so this is once again an entirely inappropriate response to women's rights, particularly during a time of COVID. So this is kind of all bad news that I'm talking about, but there has been some good things. And I know that I'm almost out of time, so I'll briefly go through this. But we have received from our community enough money every single month to sustain our trafficking program that the federal government cut. So that is incredible. The level of support of the community of London has been just phenomenal, and we are very grateful to our community for that. However, we know that not every community has that level of support, and in many cases, we can no longer refer women to organizations in other communities across Canada because their programs are shut down. So it's almost like the federal government believes trafficking is an isolated incident that occurs in only some communities. And that is, of course, very detrimental to the women and girls that we are trying to serve. I also want to say that we are seeing an increase in service at this point of about 37% for our urgent support service and about 12% for long-term counseling and support services. So while we initially saw no increase in service during COVID because women were isolated in their homes, we are now starting to see the impact of increased service. So I want to say in closing that life is very difficult for women and girls in Canada, notwithstanding that our government indicates it's a feminist government. But we continue to be encouraged by opportunities like this, our colleagues across the country and their successes, and also by our own successes. And so we know that we have so far to go until we are successful in meeting our vision statement of ending oppression of women. But we do feel some renewed hope at the moment because of the level of support that has been provided to us. So I'm very interested in hearing from all of the speakers and some questions, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity provided to the London Abused Women's Centre by Vancouver Rape Relief.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Pragna Patel, our only panelist from outside of Canada, joining us from the UK, from South Hall Black Sisters.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here amongst these amazing women doing amazing work. I feel, I mean, what can I say? This is, you know, everything that's been said is just echoed, I think, globally around the world. So I just will sort of say a little bit about the organization that I work with, of which I am the director, and the organization is called South Hall Black Sisters, which is a feminist, anti-racist, anti-fundamentalist, secular organization. We've been going for 40 years, so almost as long as I think the organization in London, Canada. And we operate as a not-for-profit advocacy and campaigning center for Black and minority women in London, but with a specific focus on the needs of South Asian women. So we really we provide holistic services to Black and minority women who remain some of the most marginalized and disadvantaged sections of our society, and are often very hard to reach in terms of supporting them. And over the decades, we've had to work to address the kind of multiple or intersectional, as it's now referred to, forms of discrimination that Black and minority women in particular experience, which is the coming together of race, gender, and other forms of inequality to create an even heightened experience of discrimination. And although we're based in West London, we do have a national reach due to the nature of our work, our campaigning work in particular. The bulk of our work is directed at assisting women and children subject to all forms of gender-based violence. And then attached to that are other related problems of racism, isolation, homelessness, mental illness, trauma, poverty, insecure immigration status, and so on. And our aim is to try and support women obtain effective protection and assert their fundamental rights to equality, justice, and freedom. So our organization is very much focused on how to improve the life outcomes of BME, Black and minority women, given the significant economic disadvantage, isolation, marginalization that they suffer both within their communities, but also outside the communities. And the women who come to our doors come from a range of Black and minority backgrounds. The largest groups are from South Asia, but others are from Africa, the Caribbean, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. And our experience shows that all BME women, like other women, experience similar experiences of gender-based violence involving financial, sexual, emotional, and of course, physical abuse. But we also focus on very culturally specific forms of abuse that arise out of culture and religious dynamics that reproduce patterns of gender control and inequality. And for example, we have also focused on the issue of forced marriage, honor-based violence, marital captivity, ritual religious abuse, domestic servitude and slavery, dowry-related violence, polygamy, forced abortions, forced pregnancy, restriction of movement, transnational marriage abandonment, and so on and so on. Our work has also tried to break many taboos, particularly within minority communities, taboos that shape women's inferior status, and particularly around domestic abuse and gender-based violence. And our aim is very much to address women's oppression and the way in which that oppression is both a cause and consequence of gender inequality. I suppose if I want to really emphasize that our services are holistic, which means that they're very much led by frontline work around which focuses on advocacy, providing casework, and that is key for us because it is only through facilitating women's access to the legal system, to the welfare system, that we can begin to kind of meet their material needs. But aside from that, there is an awful lot of work that we do provided through counseling, self-help, outreach services, group peer support to help women recover from the abuse and from trauma and to become self-sufficient and lead independent lives. So advocacy and providing counseling and support go hand in hand. We handle about 600 cases a year and about 6,000 inquiries a year. But the frontline experience, the work around advocacy, the working face-to-face with women also informs our campaigns and policy work. And so over the years, we've really campaigned to change laws and policies and implement good practice in relation to BME women. So we've been involved in changing the law on homicide in relation to battered women who kill, changed the law on provocation. We introduced legislation on forced marriage for the first time in 2007, which was the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act. We have helped to formulate statutory guidance on forced marriage and honor-based violence for key state agencies. And we're also instrumental, and this is the bit that's been really difficult, in bringing reforms in immigration law where they intersect with gender-based violence. And so, for example, we introduced the domestic violence rule and the domestic violence and destitution concession, which allows women who arrive in the UK with spousal visas and who then face domestic violence to leave the violence without fear of destitution or deportation. So pending their applications for indefinite leave to remain as victims of domestic violence, they can access welfare benefits. And our current campaign is to extend that protection to all migrant women who face gender-based violence, irrespective of the visas that they come with. And that is that's a tall order. It's been a huge, and it is a huge mountain to climb for us. So even before the crisis, the pandemic, we've drawn attention to the fact that in the UK, BME women are really vulnerable to high rates of gender-based violence, including domestic homicides. And they're really disproportionately represented in homicide figures and in suicide figures, actually. We have highlighted the multiple barriers that they face in trying to find safety. And effectively, the UK government operates a two-tier system of protection, which is discriminatory and which leaves a lot of marginalized women, particularly migrant women, out of safety or the pathways to the routes to safety that are available to women in society. We really struggle, particularly with migrant women who have insecure immigration status, to secure alternative accommodation for them, particularly because their immigration condition, one of the immigration conditions that they have is not to access public funds. It's what's called the no recourse to public funds condition. And that means that when they leave a domestic abuse situation, because they can't access the welfare safety net, they cannot escape abuse. And that includes even going to a refuge, because refuges rely on rental income, and that means women don't have access to welfare benefits to pay for the rent in a refuge. So, for example, in 2017, 4 out of 5 BME women were turned away from refuges. A large portion of them are migrant women with no recourse to public funds. And the other area that is particularly impacted on BME and migrant women is the whole edifice of the immigration system, which is discriminatory, exclusionary, and punitive. And it has become increasingly so, whereby actually immigration enforcement and the welfare functions of the state have become blurred. And what the government has done is embedded immigration enforcement officers even in structures of the welfare state, social services, the police, and so on. So particularly if you're migrant women, you're not going to report domestic abuse for fear of your data being shared with the Home Office and of being deported. So that kind of embedding of immigration enforcement functions within the welfare state has itself become a major barrier, particularly for migrant women with insecure status. So this is what we were dealing with even before COVID, struck. But what we found is what others have echoed today, is that women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in all sorts of ways. And BME women in particular have really been impacted in the UK. We already had emerging evidence from other countries even before the pandemic hit the UK about spikes in homicides, domestic homicide, spikes in domestic abuse cases. But this country did not prepare. It just did not have a plan, a crisis response to violence against women and girls, full stop, for all women and girls. And early evidence as a result has shown that not only have we experienced a spike in domestic abuse cases, but also homicide. And for example, just from the 23rd of March, when the first lockdown took place, until within a 7-week period from the 23rd of March, 36 women and 2 young children were dead. So we have seen this massive increase. So we've seen an increase whereby 5 women a week are being killed as opposed to 2 women a week on average prior to the crisis. And of course, at our centre, we've seen a 62% rise in referrals to our services. We've seen a rise in high-risk cases being referred to us, and we've seen a rise in calls to our helpline. But one of the things that I say that for us that struck us the most in responding to women who were calling us after the pandemic, after the lockdown, was that women were recounting fears of not so much physical abuse, but the psychological abuse that they had been subjected to or were being subjected to. And that was really interesting, and it was really significant. A lot of women were talking about how they were being subjected to severe forms of coercive control during the lockdown period, and that they were being trapped in what they regarded as suffocating environments for 24 hours a day without any kind of respite. So whereas previously they might have dropped children at school or run errands or, gone to the medical center for some kind of relief, they couldn't do any of those things anymore. And so they were talking about heightened forms of being subject to heightened forms of psychological abuse in particular. And this was really, really quite stark in the way that they were talking about how they were going crazy, and to use one woman's word, how one woman described it as gaslighting and so on and so forth. So that was really, really significant in what women were reporting to us. In terms of how we've responded to the situation, and by the way, the situation was even more dire for migrant women who already have no access to the welfare safety net. And sadly, despite our efforts, the government refused to suspend the no recourse to public funds rule to enable migrant women to have access to protection through refuges and so on. And like others, we also have had many challenges in trying to move from working in the office to working remotely. It has led, we do work remote. We've got a hybrid model where we have some people working in the office and some people working remotely, and we're trying to make that work. but we've had to increase our counseling, advocacy, outreach services. We've had to carry out more welfare checks on women. It takes us longer to carry out regular activities such as taking statements, gathering evidence, providing much needed legal support. And we've had to do all this at the same time as incur additional costs. For example, improve our IT infrastructure in order to move to working remotely. And what's been particularly challenging is supporting migrant women and BME women who don't have the resources or the knowledge or ability to access our services any other way except through walk-ins. And this is a group that really does rely on walking in to our center in order to access services because they don't have the resources, as Diane pointed out, you know, in terms of smartphones, even money to buy SIM cards and so on. They may not speak English. They lack lack of trust in the welfare legal system. They don't know how to navigate their way through online. And so, you know, all of these have created immense challenges for us. I think what I would like to end by saying, and I can say more about this, is that we have been very, very angry at the lack of the government's response to violence against women and girls, given that all the warning signs and indications were there in relation to what was happening in other countries before we went into lockdown. And because we were so angry, we brought a legal action against the government for its failure to provide enough support for women. And our argument was that this was sex discrimination. And we argued that whilst the government had put into place, rightly so, funded hotel accommodation for street homeless people, it was not doing the same for women subject to abuse. And we said that that was discriminatory. And as a result of that letter, I'm not joking, our lockdown happened on the 23rd of March. Our letter went out in April, and we had an expedited sort of, you know, date for response. Just a day before they were due to reply to our letter, they made £76 million available for services across the country. But it took a threat of legal action to get there. And like Megan, we also then, the London Mayor responded to our request that hotels and hostels make their accommodation available to abused women. The London Mayor decided to fund accommodation, but of course only in London. And working with another refuge, we managed to secure hotel accommodation for 70 bed spaces. But I have to say, and this was a lot of hard work on top of everything that we were facing. But what I have to say is that even engaging with a progressive mayor like the Mayor of London, I was really disappointed, because what drove us to ask for hotel accommodation from hotels and funding for women was to support migrant women. And even the Mayor of London was reluctant to allow that hotel with 70 bed spaces to be also made available to women with no recourse to public funds. And again, we had to go to the press before they allowed 20 bed spaces to be made available to migrant women. So I suppose I want to end in, you know, and sort of everything I've said echoes what's already been said, but I do want to end by saying that none of these states, none of these governments seem to have the political will to really, you know, make a difference. If a difference is being made, it's precisely because of women's struggles. And so we just have to, you know, we have a huge mountain to climb, and I'm really worried about the aftermath. I don't think we've seen the full impact of COVID-19 or the pandemic on the women that we work with. I think I mean, if things are bad, but I think they're going to get a lot worse because of the economic situation and the mental health impact and everything else that we all know is still to come in really significant amounts. So, we have a job to do, but I think at the heart of our support for women is also really holding the state to account for its failure to do what it should do, which is protect all citizens.
Last but not least, Jenny Law-Sully from La Clé in Montreal.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this great conversation with these great women. I feel very honored to be participating in this conversation. So I'm a community organization at La Clé, and La Clé is a concertation des luttes contre l'exploitation sexuelle. It's an organization here in Montreal, Quebec, that's been around for 15 years now. And we have been working in three main areas. There's the political action. We've been very much involved with making sure that the goal of a world without prostitution is known to public officials, to politicians. We've worked very hard in changing the law, making sure that the harm of prostitution is understood, and making sure that this is that this transpires in the law. We've worked with coalitions across Canada, and we're also involved internationally in that regard, in the regard of changing policies and changing laws to make sure that women and girls are protected and from sexual exploitation. So that's one area of work. We also work in research, training, and public awareness campaigns. We've done a lot of that. When La Clé started out, there was not a lot of research being done to document the reality of what women were actually going through in the sex industry. There were a lot of misconceptions, a lot of false ideas and myths going around regarding what prostitution actually was. So we very early on when La Clé came to exist, we started working with other groups of women, other community organizations, and also with universities to make sure that the reality of what was going on, of what women were actually experiencing in the sex industry was documented. So that there was a lot of work to be done in that regard here in Quebec. And we published our own research in 2014 to document the needs of young women and girls who were in the sex industry or who were trying to get out of it, and what were the obstacles that they were they had to confront, and what were actually the pathways that actually led them to prostitution. So that was a major study that we contributed to, and we still do a lot of research. Right now we're working with a university here in Montreal, with UQAM, on documenting access or lack of access that women have to the justice system, how it's difficult when a woman who has experienced violence in the sex industry, when she wants to press charges, what are all the obstacles that she is going through. So we're working a lot on research and the training, because with research we get data and then we need to share the knowledge. So we do a lot of training. We have a platform that is called Espace Vie, which is basically a space for, it's a community of people who provide services for women who are sexually exploited. So it can be social workers, community organizers, people who work in the institutional organizations such as CLSCs, hospitals, schools. We try to create a community of people who work in various areas, but all have in common a desire to provide services to women and girls who are sexually exploited. And we do a lot of webinars. We've been doing a lot of that lately, especially with the pandemic. This is something that's actually part of the governmental strategy to create partnerships and a space where people can actually come and discuss the best ways to help women, to empower them. So that's what we do. And I must add that La Clé played an important role in our provincial government strategy in fighting against sexual violence. There's a 5-year strategy that's coming to an end next year, 2021. We worked a lot to make sure that prostitution was defined as a form of violence against women. So that was part of that strategy for 5 years. So we're very proud of that we really played a big role in that governmental strategy, and we're eager to make sure, we're trying very hard to make sure that we don't lose that. We had earned like that, we were able to achieve that, to make sure that the government saw prostitution as a form of violence. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of people who have links to the sex industry lobbyists who are trying to push back against that. In 2021, we will have a lot of work to do to make sure that the government doesn't change what was in that strategy, and that they still define prostitution as a form of violence against women. So those were 2 areas that I wanted to start out with. And of course, the most important is direct support to women. So La Clé is an organization that gives support to women, not just in Montreal. It could be across Quebec, or even women from other provinces. We've had calls from women who were trafficked. In April of this year, there was an increase in the number of new women calling at La Clé. There was a 200% increase in that month following the pandemic. Because the way it works is women usually call and ask for help to get out of the sex industry. That's usually how it works. They call us for that. We do have some women who aren't necessarily ready to get out and just want to have access to our services, because we provide individual counseling, but we also give them access to group support where they can come and talk to other women and just share their experiences and not feel so isolated. So that was something that we used to do at our offices at La Clé. But with the pandemic, those groups became virtual groups. So we've been using Zoom, and the women have been, using it, and that was a way for them to keep in touch with each other. A lot of them did express that it's not the same as, being in person. So that's something that has affected us and has affected the women, to not have the possibility of coming to our offices and sitting around in a circle and talking. It's really something that they find difficult. One thing that we did do during the summer is meet in parks. We've done that because there was really a demand. The women did ask us for that opportunity. So we did do 2 group meetings in parks not far from La Clé. And it was something that the women found really, really helpful. So the pandemic has affected us in many ways, like it's affected everyone. A lot of our work is through the phone, through Zoom meetings. We did keep like rotating schedules. There was always someone in the office, but we did reduce our hours or try to do a lot of things virtually, also using Zoom or other types of applications like that. And we really try to meet the needs to really answer to the needs of women. A lot of women were going through tough financial times. So we tried to help them in that way. We went and got all the grants that we could get. We asked for donations. On top of asking for government grants, we asked those who support us to help us to give that direct financial help to women. So there was a lot of needs in terms of a lot of food insecurity. Women couldn't buy food basically. So we went and got grocery stores cards and started handing them out or mailing them to the women. And that really, they told us that that was really, really helpful. We helped them with that. And basically we also have groups for family members also of women who are sexually exploited. We find that very often they have nowhere to turn. No one takes them seriously, especially if their child is over 18 years old. It's like they're not supposed to suffer or find, that they are also impacted by the violence that their child is going through if they're over 18 years old. So we also have group meeting for family members of women in the sex industry. Yeah, that's something that we've been working a lot on. And another aspect, another area that we're developing at La Clé is really in terms of shelter. What we found during the pandemic, when the pandemic broke out, is that women who wanted to stop, to get out of the sex industry had nowhere to go. Very often we have shelters that are reluctant to take in women who are in the sex industry. They feel that it's not exactly this, it's not the same as women who are going to domestic violence. They feel that if the women have pimps that are looking for them, it might put the other women in danger. So there's a lot of problems sometimes to find shelter for these women. We often insist on the fact that pimps are also very often boyfriends or spouses who we have a lot of cases like that. And so we when we have cases like that, we need to make sure that the domestic violence shelter understands that this is also a case of domestic violence plus sexual exploitation. So a lot of our work is making sure that women are not, given access to those domestic violence shelter when they should actually have access. There are also crisis, they call, here in Quebec, they call it centre de crise, which is a crisis shelter. So it's not just domestic violence. So we've turned to that. And we've had to make basically partnerships with hotels also during the pandemic for cases where it was really urgent that to make sure that the women had some place to go. We did do a partnership with the police in on the South Shore, because they had already a sort of an understanding with hotels on the South Shore, and we decided to develop those same type of entente, which agreement with hotels here in Montreal. So that's what we've been working on. And we actually created another organization, which we call Un Toit pour Elle, which is like a roof over her head in English. And that other organization will be providing apartments for women. We're trying to set up really to either buy, or we're still in the process of looking exactly how we're going to do this, but ideally we would like to have our own building where women could have access to apartments. And so this is what we're working on, because we find that not being able to have a place to go is really, really one of the biggest obstacles for women. One of the reasons why they go back to the sex industry after they've come out. So this is really something that in the next few years, La Clé will be working very, very hard on with all of our partners. We're an organization that has, we're actually a coalition. There are 50 organizations that are members of La Clé. And so we're working closely with them to basically making sure that a world without prostitution will be possible soon. Voila.
Thank you. And I said last but not least, but there's Hilla, of course.
Well, here to a world without prostitution. Mm-hmm. And I'll respond first to you, Janilo, because we are in so much agreement that women in prostitution should stay in battered women transition houses. And our house is open to women in prostitution. Not only so often the pimp is the boyfriend, the husband, the lover, but also it is a very, very harsh form of male violence. And sometimes women come to us to escape from a particular John or particular pimp, and sometimes just to get a respite. And on the other hand, when we have close relationship with the battered women in our house, we discover how often they have to prostitute themselves, maybe not on a regular basis, but to have sex with the landlord if they cannot pay the rent, or towards Christmas to buy gift for the children. So there is a false dichotomy, an Asian dichotomy between the women in prostitution and we married women that we constantly try to break. So as Diane said, first, not for a second, because I already talked, it's so good to be with you women. And Megan mentioned hope. Those connections, those relationships do give us hope and do make us stronger. And Diane said that at the beginning there was kind of a hope that sexual exploitation will stop or will decline when COVID started, and it didn't happen. And that was also our notion. It felt like the whole world is stopping, but violent men did not stop. But also women did not stop resisting. And every woman who calls us, we see her as a woman in resistance. And some of the calls that we got were very similar to the call that we get at all times. And I will give you some examples. Women called us in relation to prostitution, women who stopped prostitution, but they were escaping from a particular genre pimp. Women who needed a respite from prostitution, but we did see a few calls from women that actually the first lockdown that was very strict and kind of gave them a break from prostitution, got them to reconnect to their families. And if these were women who were not from British Columbia, they called us to ask us to get them back home. So we help with taxis. With one woman, we helped with a flight or a Greyhound bus, and we also got contacts from other provinces who ask us to help their girls to come back home. So that was a moment of break that allowed women to look a little bit outside of the situation, and there was an urgency to connect to your home and to your family. So when those young women did not come from abusive homes, they resorted to prostitution for other reasons, it was easier to connect and for them to go back home. We also had a couple of women who were trafficked from another country, and the break that they had got them to connect with us, and some of them stayed with us, some of them stayed other places, and their main work was to secure their status and to make sure that Canada allows them to stay. We had the classic calls. Many women called us seeking a way to leave an abusive male partner. And our analysis, at least in our zone, that there are no more violent men. But definitely, I think Pragna mentioned it, women have much less respite. They do not go to work. They do not take the kids to the library. There was much less grocery shopping. There were no possibility to go to the park in the afternoon or to send the kids to other friends to do homework. Like the usual strategies that women have to deal with the abusive husband, they lost them when the abuser and the woman and the children were constantly in the same home. But still, women were really resourceful. We had women who do not have a cell phone called us from pharmacies who stayed open the whole time, from Shoppers or London Drugs or pharmacies. We had women calling us from neighbors. We had women calling us for their sisters. The sister texted them, and the woman called us. We had mothers calling us. We had co-worker calling us, and we actually had a few cases of men who saw a distressed woman in the street or in the yard, and they used their phone to connect the woman with us. So if we're talking about hope, we definitely saw that the strict lockdown and strict instruction for social isolation did not interfere with women offering solidarity, assistance, mutual aid. We had quite a few women calling us already safe at a friend's house, or have a safety plan with a friend that just needed our assistance to get them there. Or we had women traveling from other places in British Columbia or other provinces, and their friend would call us while the woman was on the ferry or on the plane, on the bus, in the car, to make sure that they can stay with us or another place that we secure for them. So we saw a lot of network and a lot of support of women and other women. And we actually were quite, I don't know what the word, maybe lucky it is, but we actually got some financial support in general because we do so much independent fundraising. And ironically, the fact that we were attacked quite a lot in the last few years got so many women and people from Vancouver, from Canada, and from the rest of the world to express a support with individual small donations, but many of them. So we have quite a lot of freedom of how to use our money. So we always were able to offer above and beyond, but also we got some federal money to buy women laptops and cell phones. We got provincial money to accommodate women in hotels, and sometimes we prefer to use Airbnb. And just recently we rented a 3-bedroom Airbnb, so 3 families could live it together, and some of us are going hang out with them there. So we kind of mimicking the way we work in our own transition house in other places and other sites. We do have another space, so if women did not have the privacy through Zoom to participate in a support group, she could go to our other space, and she had the computers there, and she participated through the Zoom. And sometime we did break social distancing and lockdown. If women needed the medical help, we would go with them to get medical help and to get the rape kit. When women needed to do statement, well, we did not really broke them. We just judged that those things are essentials. So we implemented our own judgment on what essential it is. And a lot of times standing beside a woman, going with a woman to places, seeing her in person was an essential thing to do. So we had the ability to do that. Let's see what other point prepared for you. Yes, we saw in terms of battered women that men that they left, but I think it's a global phenomenon, let alone Canadian, but that the family court, regardless of how violent men are, they're more often than not will allow men access, custody, visitation. So men did use the lockdown and the social distancing to really trying to undermine the custody agreement that there is, and kind of torture women with returning the kids, not returning the kids. They use the limitation and the chaos to interfere with women's motherhood, which is not new to us. And as all of you mentioned, women who are in economic need, and many women are, and we have a lot of the women that we work with are women who are no longer in crisis, but definitely see us as part of their community or part of their ongoing support. So we got a lot of requests from women, or a lot of women call us troubled and worried on how to pay rent and how to pay bill and how to buy food. And we use their money to help them with that. And we also have a very supportive community. So when we post on Facebook that a woman needs a crib, or a woman needs a table and a desk for her child, or a kid needs this and that to be able to participate in online schooling, we got very, very responsive answer from the community, because most services that usually support women in poverty, like food banks or thrift store, were closed in many times during COVID. So we were able through our community to answer to that. And of course, the women who had precarious earning, women on welfare, and I think it's true for all over Canada, there is no way women can survive on welfare. So some women, and we have huge poverty issue. We have 17,000 single mothers in British Columbia are on welfare. So they're just poor. A lot of women have all kinds of ways to get a little bit more of money and working under the table, and all those possibilities were gone, and they were not eligible for economic support from the government. And we all know this is also true for all the undocumented migrant workers. So we definitely helped much more than usual with material needs, with helping women paying for very, very basic necessities. I wanted to say one more point in terms of rape. So we did see, especially in the first lockdowns, women did not call us about date rapes, rapes in party, and other rapes that are very common in social circumstances, because people really took seriously the instruction of not to socialize with other people. But women, of course, kept calling us about being raped by men who has close proximity to them. So husbands and boyfriend, roommates, landlord, neighbors, and co-workers. So it just shifted a little bit what some men have access to, but it definitely did not change men entitlement, men accessibility, and men's violence against women. That's me.
Thank you, Hila. Yeah, so some questions from the audience now. Thank you to all our panelists who spoke. This first one is for Pragna. As an immigrant woman myself, I've seen immigration as holding absolute power over migrants, including and especially myself. My question is, how successful are you in helping migrant women with permanent status, without permanent status, avoid deportation and gain access to public funds during this time?
Okay, so yes, how successful are we? It's a mixed picture, to be honest. One of the things we're really proud about is the fact that we managed to get women who come to the UK on spousal visas, who come to the UK on the basis of marriage. We managed to get protection for them by reforming the immigration laws. That took 20 years to get there. But we finally managed. We began in the early 90s, and 2002, we had introduced the domestic violence rule, which says that if you have come to the UK on the basis of marriage and your marriage breaks down due to domestic violence, and if you can evidence that domestic violence, you know, because if you reported it to women's organizations, to GP, police, or you've gotten court protection order, or you go pursuing criminal proceedings, or if you can evidence it in some way, then you can apply to remain in the UK as a victim of domestic violence. So that's the domestic violence rule. And then it took another 10 years of struggle and campaigning before we managed to get the domestic violence destitution concession. And that basically says that pending your application to remain in the UK as a victim of domestic violence, you can access basic services, welfare services, benefits. And that then enables women to be placed in refuges and other safe accommodation, or even in private accommodation, because they can pay for it and they can pay for food and things. So that's something we're really proud of. It took 20 years to get there. And more recently, the government has introduced the Domestic Abuse Act, or about to. It's at the moment going through Parliament, so it's a domestic abuse bill. It contains no protection for migrant women, and we are trying to use the act, the bill, to extend the protection that's available for women with visas, spousal visas, to other women, migrant women who don't have visas, because those who don't have spousal visas, because those women remain unable to access protection of any kind because they don't have access to the safety net. And the way in which we are challenging governments on two fronts. Of course, on the one front, we're looking at legal strategies to bring challenges using human rights law, using equality law. The government is about to ratify the Istanbul Convention, which is a European Convention on combating violence against women and girls. And in there, it clearly states that the government cannot discriminate on the basis of migrant status. So we're trying to invoke that to try and get the protections in the bill. But separate from that, and during COVID, we also tried to get the no recourse to public funds condition suspended so that everyone had access to accommodation and support if they needed it. And that the government never agreed to do that. Aside from that, we have also been very fortunate in the sense that we've had donors, funders, particularly during the pandemic. Paradoxically, we've had more funding than we have otherwise to support women directly. So we've used the funds that we have gathered to provide for accommodation for women and to provide basic medical and food and meet basic food, basic needs. It's not enough. And we often have to supplement it by also using food banks, donations of food, clothes, toys from wherever we get it. So we also continue that kind of fundraising to raise funds to support women who don't have access to the welfare safety net because of their immigration status. So it's a two-pronged strategy. On the daily level, we have to meet women's needs for accommodation, for food, for immediate support. And the only way to do that is to raise funds specifically for these women, but separately to try and use legal strategic litigation and policy and campaigning to try and push for more permanent change. So those are just some of the ways in which we have tried to tackle this problem. And it's been a really, really hard struggle, and it's getting harder because you also come up against a government that is pushing what we in the UK call a hostile immigration environment policy, which is basically there is a deliberate policy strategy on the part of successive governments to make the environment for migrants so difficult that people so-called voluntarily leave. And of course, there is no evidence to suggest that that policy works. But part of making the environment a hostile environment for migrants means what I said about embedding enforcement functions within welfare state, about just enacting more and more draconian laws. So for example, landlords carrying out checks before they can rent to migrants, employers carrying out checks before they can employ people, health services carrying out checks before they can provide health services, schools carrying out checks on, you know, children even. So this is part of what we have, what is known as the hostile immigration environment policy. So it's kind of, you're up against it, as if you like. Not only are you dealing with gender-based violence and gender inequality, you're also dealing with the racism of the state itself that is embedded in the immigration structure itself. So, you know, it has to be multiple strategies at multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And someone in the comments also is appreciating that you're trying to hold the government accountable to provide safety and dignity for women. Great. Some other comments that are being said, such important insights about increased risk and struggles of women in prostitution and further marginalization of Indigenous women. Thank you, Diane. Amazing how so many of the same themes carry through different talks, actually during our series, about how porn has a huge influence on male violence that women experience and that women experience in prostitution. So there's a question for Megan. Were there reasons given by the government for removing the anti-trafficking funding?
Well, we originally had funding through a 5-year project announced by the Conservative government, and it was through a fund they called the MAPI Fund. And during, you know, about a year prior to that funding ending, we reached out to the government to ask, where do we go now? What do we do? And we were directed to apply through other funds. And then at the end of the day, those funds were inadequate to fund the existing MAPI funded programs, along with all those new ones. So, I mean, Leclerc was the same. They did not get their renewed funding. Almost every organization I actually spoke to across the country that received previous funding did not receive any further funding. And I'm not sure if Leclerc has now received any funding through the specialized targeted grant, but we have applied through all of the mechanisms through the federal government, met all of the timelines, and to date, we are advised, even as recently as today, that the government is still reviewing the applications. So we've gone basically from March 31st until even including today, and I'm sure it'll go on for another period of time without funding. And it's incredibly disappointing because not only the funding is gone, but it also indicates to me a shift away from making sex trafficking a priority for the government to address. And so it's easy to talk. It's much less, you know, easy to provide funding to ensure all women have immediate access to service, particularly those who are most vulnerable and who may only reach out once. And if they can't be seen on that first time they reach out, they are hopeless and they go back to their trafficker and believe, falsely, but it's their belief, that it is as good as it's going to get. And it's just absolutely, to me, tragic that the federal government had an opportunity to increase funding and make a real stand in favor of feminism and a feminist government, and instead chose to go in another direction.
Speaking of that, on the decisions the government or the Liberal Party and the Conservative did, we now know that the 20 top billionaires companies in Canada during the pandemic made $37 billion. It's approximately $2 billion more to each company. And the NDP tried to pass a law proposing to tax billionaires who have more than $20 billion, 1% tax, and no one from the Liberal federal party or the Conservative Party supported that. So I think in Canada in general, we saw a few interesting things. We definitely saw a very, very responsive, fairly immediate fairly comprehensive economic response for better agreement transition houses, for the CERB, for students, not for everybody, but significant population, significant part of the population got economic support that carried them through, which as usual proves that if there is a will, there is a way. And what also we saw that a lot of middle-class people use the time and the change of practices to really evaluate their life and to look around. And I don't remember who said it, I think probably everybody, about COVID magnified the inequality, and a lot of people are now want to see change. A lot of people are self-critical of their own consumerism, their own participation in the capitalist forces, of the degradation of the earth, and a lot of people want to see change. So I think there is opportunity to galvanize this goodwill and the sense of solidarity that we have to press the government to really move forward and to enact some very important economic reforms that will undermine the social, economic, political inequalities that we have here.
Jenny-Laure, you would like to?
Yes, I just wanted to answer Megan's question about the funding. Yes, we did lose that funding also, but there was this targeted call to apply for funding from the Public Security Ministry, and we did that, and they did get back to us and asked us to change our proposal. So we're in that process. So we're told that when you're being asked to modify your proposal, it's supposed to mean that you will eventually get an approval. So we're hoping that's true. But I do, you know, we do reflect on the fact that it's even when we get an approval, it's like for a 3-year program or a 4-year program. And it's really that vision that is so short-sighted, really. There's not a long-term commitment. So that's something we worry a lot about.
If I could just pick up on that, it's interesting to me because that targeted call for proposal was, the deadline for that was June, and we're now in December, and still you don't have the funding. So again, to me, that speaks to the lack of priority that the government's giving to this issue. And I actually am amazed, but our provincial government, Conservative government, the Doug Ford government in Ontario, shifted all of our trafficking funds away from grants to core funding. And so we agree, it should never be dependent on 2 or 3 or 4 years. That funding, if it's the priority of the government, should be given and renewed on an ongoing basis without application, provided that the quality of service meets the standards. So it's incredible to me that in Ontario, it was our Doug Ford government, very conservative government, that was the one that shifted that for us.
I had a question also. So Diane, you mentioned that right off the bat in your portion about guaranteed livable income. What are your demands from any government, so whether municipal, provincial, or federal, that would elevate women's burden during COVID?
Yeah, and I thank you for that. I first want to acknowledge that particularly for vulnerable women and the organizations that are at the front lines helping, that things are, you know, the longer COVID is going on, the harder it is. It's harder for women to get by day to day. It's harder for organizations to adapt, and organization and helpers are getting exhausted and tired as well. And so we're really, this is really a hard time and getting harder, particularly for the women that are the most vulnerable, and for the organizations and their helpers that are busting their butts to reach out and help and to address those gaps that are in the lives of particularly vulnerable women and girls. And just, you know, just similar to what do you do to disempower a woman is very similar to what you do to disempower an organization, is you take their money away. And that is really a sad reality for many organizations. And we heard just a couple of examples here already around taking money away, and then really having no other option or no other, and then limit her capacity or her opportunities to change it. And so that is that's, you know, literally a snapshot of the reality of a woman's life and many grassroots community-led organizations right now. And so that's really important to note. And so what can we do about that? There is, especially for when we're talking about Indigenous women and girls, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, we have to look at those systems that have created the marginalization and the vulnerability in the first place. So you know, we are seeing, and colonization is all about create the system so that there is always a winner and there's always a loser. And certainly the reality for Indigenous people in Canada is that we're always the loser. So we will always be behind. We will always not get ahead. We will always be very distinct in our marginalization, and that's because the system is set up to do that. So how do you get out of that? You get out of that by the First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous right holders having the opportunity and the resources and the mandate by governments that to do something about it, because we have the answers. We have the answers within First Nation, Métis, and Inuit rights holders. We have the answers in urban Indigenous-led organizations. We know what we need to do and what needs to happen in order to improve the lives of Indigenous women and girls and families and, you know, all of our communities. We have the answers, and the system disempowers that and silences because, again, it boils down to who has the power, who has the money, who is allowed to exercise their rights and who's not. So while I say that, we know that the Manitoba Missing and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's National Inquiry concluded that we have genocide in our country, that in our government and many provincial governments have agreed that genocide has occurred in the lives of First Nation, Métis, Inuit women and girls, and I would add two-spirited LGBTQIA. And so there has been work, you know, and as you talk about what's government doing about it, there has been work by the federal and provincial governments on looking at how to bring life and action into the 231 calls for justice. And there is some national work going on. In fact, I'm chairing an urban sub-working group as part of co-creating and co-developing a national action plan to come up with solutions on how and how to address that genocide and how to prevent it, how to intervene, and how to have that just a part of our history, and recognizing that Indigenous people need to be leading in that process because we have the answers. So those, I want to say that because it's really critically important to and I know that the federal government has done not a lot in a lot of areas, and it is taking some bravery on behalf of the federal and provincial governments that are fully engaged. And there's even some cities sporadically across the country that are also stepping forward with those wanting to be part of the solution. And so that's in, you know, my 30 years of working and at the grassroots level have not seen that level of genuine sincerity about wanting to be solution focused and put your money behind and shifting power and decision making and having those real tough conversations that those are happening. So there is some hope in that area with what some the levels of government, and when I say levels of government, I am including First Nation, Métis, and Inuit governments in that, because they are the rights holders, and they have a really important place in leading much of the solutions. And so I'm hopeful for a couple of reasons. One is we had, you know, if I bring it to, you know, our organization, who just prior to the pandemic, we had done some work with our welfare system. So this is our EIA, Employment and Income Assistance Department, where they were cutting women off, sexually exploited women off of welfare, because that you have to produce your bank statement. And when you see the bank statement, you see the money going in and money going out. And that's the reality of sexual exploitation. Oftentimes women are having to hand that over to a trafficker. Oftentimes they're having to hand that over to multiple people that are also exploiting them. And so it's not income, it's not really considered income. And so she shouldn't be penalized because it is deemed as income, when it is part of the whole system of sexual exploitation, and is really a representation of the victimization that she is experiencing. So being in a province that has a provincial strategy around sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in Manitoba, we understand that she is not a criminal either. She is a woman who has every right to receive service, and so she shouldn't be criminalized. She should be offered services instead. And just the last thing I'll say, and this, you know, has just come out recently, and I'm hopeful for the future with the federal economic plan, hoping everybody's all on board with it. If anything, you know, as it passes, I hope it gets better in terms of violence against women. But the $724 million investment outlined in that plan across the country over the next 5 years, you know, it brings me some hope that we can, again, as a collection of leaders on this issue, that we can really tap into those resources, so that we are again representing the grassroots and on the front lines to end this, you know, most horrific form of violence against women and girls and two-spirited LGBTQIA in our country. Anyway.
Any other panelists would like to respond on what demands are you asking from different levels of government?
Hello? Okay, yeah. So you know I have my list here.
Yeah.
First, Diana, I want to echo what you said about the response to Indigenous people. Statistics Canada just released this morning devastating, and not that new to us, but who work on the sexual assault field, devastating data that the women in the territories, and we know that all those surveys, even the anonymous one, are very, very underreported, but more than half of the women said they were raped after the age of 15, and 63 of the women who said they were raped as girls said they were also raped as adults. So we have a terrible situation of violence against women and children, and it's even worse when it comes to Indigenous women and children. And speaking about the missing and murder Indigenous women inquiry, they were weak on some things, including prostitution, but we were party withstanding, and there was one recommendation that we made that they accepted and echoed in full, and that's a call for guaranteed livable income. And I know that's the first thing that you said, Diane, when you joined us, so this is a really, really good time to echo for that, and to separate it from the proposal for basic income, because we want it to be guaranteed and we want it to be livable. I think the welfare system showed charities, handouts do not alleviate people's poverty. And we have to transform from a liberal welfare state to a state that really takes care, I think Pragna said it and Megan echoed it, of all its people. regardless of citizenship status.
Mm-hmm.
Some other reforms that we need. The BC coroner says that 2020 probably will become British Columbia's worst year for overdose deaths. This year alone, we had 274 women died of overdose in British Columbia. And we know the drug is a very, very close, I want to say friend or enemy of women in prostitution and poverty. We also have an estimation of 2,230 women in the province who are visibly homeless. So not the women who are crashing on someone's couch, women who are in shelters, a homelessness shelter, and in the street. So housing is a huge issue across the country and in the province, and we know that there are a lot of empty housing here, and we want the government to increase the empty houses taxes, but also we have to have rent control. And there are ways to make it possible. It's a reform that doesn't cost nothing to the provincial and the municipal government. It will require some kind of mechanism to make sure that now that landlords will not give their place to the higher bidder, will also not abandon standard of living, but it's possible to enforce. But housing is crucial, as we all know. And the point that I wanted to make about women and addiction is we have to have detox and recovery for women on demand. In September, we lost a woman we worked with. Every time she was ready for detox, there was no space for her. And so we need on-demand, women-only detox and recovery places, and we also need hope. And GLI ministry supporting women to keep their children instead of apprehending the children. Alternative will give women hope. There is a great reform that now in considering many places in the world, and we want to see happening here, is free public transit. The freedom of movement does need to belong to everybody and not just those who own private property of cars. We want everybody to have access to higher education. We want everybody to have nutritious, organic, locally grown food, and it's simple to do it by either subsidize the buyer or the local growers. And of course, we have to hold men accountable for the male violence against women. There is a serious debate now within the feminist movement and the anti-violence movement. What does accountability mean? For us, it still means that we want a state to hold men accountable. The state has a responsibility to protect women. We do separate criminalization, conviction, and imprisonment. It's not the same. We see a huge value for a man to face court and a judge who said, you wronged this woman. And the Canadian data shows that only 20% of cases reported to police will even end up in trial, and only half of them in conviction. So 80% are a no, and nothing will happen to begin with. And we know how few women will actually go to the police. So we have to really get on board with accountability of men. We're calling on men of conscience not to be just satisfied with the fact that they're not raping or not beating women. They have to create a standard that it's an unacceptable behavior. And of course, criminalizing all forms of male violence against women, incest, wife bettering, rape, and prostitution. This is me.
Can I add to that, Hilla? Because I really agree with what you're saying about the justice system and the difficulty for women, in our experience, entering the justice system is that the timeline it takes from the time they first go to the police until there is an actual trial is sometimes, even with the Jordan case, as long as 3 years, and even going to be longer now because of COVID. And the difficulty is women do go on with their lives. Women are resilient, and with appropriate supports, they can move on with their lives, and they do. And 3 years after a rape where they know they're going to be put on the stand and interrogated as if they were the offender, it's difficult for them to fathom how they can go back to that place and continue with the new life they've created. And the criminal justice system, just like the family justice system, is built based on patriarchal needs. And and has consistently failed women over time and continues to. And as we have progressed into things like technology, which is supposed to make it more succinct and easier to flow, what we see instead is when it comes to women's issues, their complaints or their allegations are minimized.
Yeah.
And even with domestic violence now and domestic violence courts, what we see is that if the offender enters an agreement to a peace bond, his charges are completely withdrawn. So he then goes back to the workplace and back to his community and said, see, I told you all along she was a liar. And there is never any mention in the courts at that time of the harm, significant harm caused to her. And we see this also in prostitution, where women are really extremely vulnerable and violated, and their pimps have rape scenes planned for them, for the man, so that he has a key to enter her hotel room. She's not even expecting him, and he arrives and completely dismantles her as a human being even further than she has been already. And when we speak with her about going to the police about these issues, she will not go, and she says there's no point. I hope one day I will have a better life, and I hope that happens before a trial would ever take place. And I'm not going to take the chance of going through this process and having him walk out the door to tell everybody what a horrendous liar I am. So for me, it's like peeling the onion. It's always like peeling the onion. And I want to get to the core source of the problem. I want to get inside that onion. And what we need to do is completely dismantle our criminal justice system, completely dismantle our family court system, and build it from the ground up with a feminist lens. Because we have to recognize that as a society that it is women that are being violated. This is men's violence against women, male violence against women. And until we start looking at that through this lens, we will continue to have a justice system built on patriarchy.
I would add that access to justice is one of the key areas, I think, of focus for those of us who've been working around gender-based violence for so long. Of course, patriarchy is at the core of it. So is racism, so is classism, so is all these things. And that then disproportionately impacts different groups in different ways. So there are similarities and dissimilarities. But for me, one of the most urgent things is access to legal aid. In order to even access justice, you need the lawyers to represent. And we have a real crisis in the UK because legal aid has just been shrunk. The budget has been shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And we had this really quite grotesque situation, particularly in relation to the family court system, whereby women who've been abused could not access legal aid and therefore found themselves representing themselves in court, particularly in relation to children matters, and finding themselves having to cross-examine their abusers, having to be cross-examined by their abusers, and the trauma, the reliving of trauma, but worse, the intimidation and the fear that generates. So there's been major campaigning going on in the UK to try and get that stopped because it just, in no other circumstances would women be expected to face their abusers in that way. And it's just a travesty of justice, but it is brought about by the fact that they have no access to legal aid. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how the real casualty has been the family justice system. And the real casualty has been private children proceedings. So whereas legal aid is available if children are in the care of the state, there is no legal aid available if they're private family proceedings. And it's like And it reinforces this idea that what goes on in the private sphere is not as serious. And that does come back to the whole patriarchal, you know, kind of division of public-private, which as feminists, we've always tried to break down, because the private is, the personal is also political.
Exactly.
But for us, the whole access to legal aid, not just for women, but other vulnerable groups, is critical, because without that, you cannot even seek remedies in court. You can't use the justice system at all. And the other thing I would say is that we always manage to gain something, and then there are 3 steps backwards that we face. So we, you know, having got to a point in the UK where we had a major review on the family justice system, which is actually for the first time scrutinized the other really pernicious thing that was going on, which was the assumption that in where children are involved, there has to be both parents involved in the care of the child. So that kind of parental assumption, the 2-parent assumption, has not taken into account experiences of abuse and violence, and children's experiences of abuse and violence, directly or indirectly. And just when we had a major review on this, and spotlight was actually shone on the way in which this whole contact culture, where it didn't matter if women were going through abuse, abusers had a right to see their children, where that was all you know, examined and questioned, the government then sets up another review to remedy it, but involving only male groups as representatives who are pushing this agenda in the first place. So there's been this whole attempt by women's groups to say, well, where is the interests of mothers represented here? Where are the interests of women who are subject to abuse represented here? You're quick to take on board fathers who've been mobilizing and actually galvanizing politically to ensure that their rights, their interests are protected in these situations. So my wider point is the way in which you do through women's resistance, we make these gains, and then we find ourselves in the same breath in another part of the state, you know, going backwards. And that constant vigilance that we need to, you know, it's like plate tectonics. It's like we're on these shifting plates all the time, being careful and balancing all the time, you know, so that we don't lose our eyes on all the balls that we're juggling in the air at the same time. You know, access to justice is important. The provision of specialist domestic violence services, there's not enough. There really isn't. And there is a fear that generic services are taking over specialist services because it's a question of cutting costs. And that means that by and for services are being eradicated. So the gains that we made 30, 40 years ago for BME women or LBGT or any other group to run services because they're best placed to determine, you know, their needs and address them, are now actually facing a major backlash and are being completely eradicated. So for us, another demand of the government is, you know, sufficient funding to make sure there are specialist services tackling gender-based violence around the country as well. And those are just, yeah. And the third thing I would say is that we have a government that's trigger happy in enacting laws. So on the surface, it looks like, wow, there's a law on domestic abuse, right? The fact that it's actually quite flimsy is another matter. There is a law on, you know, victims' rights that they're going to introduce next year. None of these laws make any difference because they're resource neutral. They don't allow for the resources that are needed to enact these laws and to implement them, make them meaningful. So I'm almost kind of at that point where I feel I'm up to here with more laws and yet more laws and asking for yet more laws, when all of them, it's easy for the government to be seen to be doing something, but actually it's doing nothing because none of them are backed by the need, by sufficient resources to make them meaningful. So I think that's the other issue, you know, is that we constantly ask for laws and they're happy to enact laws as long as they don't have to put resources into it.
Really good points, and we need to keep fighting. We're almost out of time, but Diane would like to respond quickly.
Yeah, no, I actually want to, I know we have just 5 minutes left, and really put a public appeal to people that are on this call and those that may be watching this on Facebook Live, or I actually don't even know how that works, but watching later, that 2021 is going to be a really critical year as it relates to reviewing the prostitution legislation. This really is, you know, a call to action for all of the advocates across this country to be involved. We need your help. We need your advocacy because it is really, it's critically important that we put a lot of effort and a lot of advocacy to ensure at the very least things remain the same, and where there are opportunities to enhance, it is for the absolute protection of the most vulnerable women and girls who need us to speak for them right now, and and we need your help to do that.
Here. Yeah. Great. One comment before we wrap it up. It says here, power to the women. Women got the power. Sisters, can you hear us? We are getting stronger by the hour. Power and power. I think that lots of appreciations on the chat and in the comments. So that resonates with what you said today. So thank you so much for all our panelists for speaking today and sharing about their work. Thank you to our audience that tuned in on Zoom and Facebook. And so as you know, this video will be available right away on demand on Facebook. We will put it on our website eventually once the series is over as well. And we invite you to watch tomorrow's event. It's called Women Only Organizing at 11 Vancouver time, 11 a.m. And you can watch, once again, online on Facebook and on Zoom. All the details are on our website. So see you tomorrow, and thank you so much.
Love to you all.
Bye.